Hi everyone, my name is Allison Fennell. I am a senior marine science major here at BU as well as the Boston University Marine Science Association president. I'd like to welcome you all to today's lecture. It is the fourth Discoveries lecture of this year and the ninth of the series. And this series really is a cornerstone in our philosophy of extending the learning community to alumni and reflecting the breadth of a liberal arts education. So much of what we do here at BU is made possible by the generous alumni, friends, and parents who support our annual fund. So really quickly, I just wanted to talk about the Cohen Challenge, which is going on right now. It is being sponsored by trustee and alumnus Richard Cohen, CGS class of 1967 and SMG class of 1969. And up until June 30th, every single dollar that you donate will be matched by Richard Cohen up to $1 million, which is pretty cool. So I'm strongly encouraging everyone to participate, and if you are interested, there's more information up at the registration table. And to get this lecture started, I'm going to bring up Professor John Finnerty, but before I do, I just wanted to talk a little bit about him. He earned his PhD from the University of Chicago and is an associate professor of biology here at BU, as well as the BU Marine Program Director. He also teaches the natural science courses in the core curriculum. Professor Finnerty's areas of interest include evolution of development, developmental genetics, evolutionary genomics, and invertebrate zoology. His research lab at BU tackles fundamental questions in biodiversity using an interdisciplinary approach that combines genomics, genetics, molecular biology, developmental biology, organismal biology, and ecology. And I hope I got it all, because it's kind of a lot. His primary research involves coastal marine invertebrates, and he does a lot of really cool stuff. But that's all I have to say, so we can bring up Professor Finnerty now, and he will introduce the rest of the panelists.
Thank you, Allison, and thank you, everybody, for coming here today. I want to welcome everybody and wish you a happy Earth Day. Let's hear it for Earth. All right. My favorite planet in the solar system. I hope it's yours. I just wanted to welcome you to the Discovery Series discussion. It's entitled Footprints in the Sea. And I also think that it's very appropriate on this Earth Day that we sort of ponder humanity's effects on the oceans, the very reason that the blue planet is blue. And I want to start by actually introducing the other panelists who are going to give short talks a little bit later. First, I'd like to start off by introducing Professor Murray from the Department of Earth Sciences. Rick, if you wouldn't mind just standing just for 1 second so they can see your face. Thanks. So, Rick studies the chemical. Yeah, wait for the yay. Okay. Rick studies the chemical signature of oceanographic and climatological processes. He also studies sea level changes and climate, and he's going to talk to us today specifically about carbon, climate, and ocean acidification. You can see why it was so important I had him stand, because he's hard to recognize in this particular photo from the field. The very dashing red color, though. Very flattering. And I'd like to introduce also Professor Fulweiler, also from the Earth Sciences Department and also from the BU Marine Program. Actually, I forgot to mention that Rick was the former director of the Boston University Marine Program, and he actually kicked off its sort of rebirth as an interdisciplinary major here at Boston University, which formally began in 2008. Wally is now the associate director of the BU Marine Program. Her interests include energy flow and the movement of nutrients in a variety of environments, and she's going to talk to us today about nutrient cycling. Specifically, she's going to focus on nitrogen and how nitrogen from various sources can affect ocean ecosystems. And then we're also going to be hear from Professor Les Kaufman. Les, if you could turn it on. Les's flight landed about, 5 minutes ago? In bad weather, he saw that lightning storm from the air, which is really the place that's the place you want to see a lightning storm, is from the inside. That's right. Les is in the biology department and also in the BU Marine Program. He studies marine ecology, the structure and function of marine ecosystems, including the conservation of marine biodiversity. And he's going to talk to us about some diving he's recently done in the Phoenix Islands, a very remote stretch of ocean, and what he learned while he was there. Okay. And here I am. Here I am with my sons Roger and Mateo. I'm also in the biology department and the current director of the BU Marine Program. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about something we call the Coral Whisperer Project, where we try to basically ask the corals about the condition of marine ecosystems. And before I go any farther, you can see that we're all united, in addition to our love for marine ecosystems and marine questions, we're all part of BUMP, the new BUMP, the BU Marine Program, which is an interdisciplinary major that came online in 2008. Here we have some photos from our students. There's numerous students scattered in the audience. This is an interdisciplinary undergraduate major. It's a very rigorous major. And if you come to BU and take this major, you'll have the opportunity to do quite a number of very interesting things in the marine semester. So the marine semester is this intensive research semester where you take 4 consecutive courses, each a month long, in important areas of modern marine science with a faculty member who's an active researcher in that area of marine science. And so you may get the chance to, for example, sail the seas, learn to dive as you explore diverse marine environments in New England and also in the tropics. So we stay here in New England in September and October. And then in November and December, we have courses that take place in the Caribbean and in a Belizean coral reef. You get to work in a state-of-the-art marine teaching lab that's located in the basement of the biology building, and also a very impressive aquarium facility that's managed by Justin Skase, who's an aquarist that was originally at New England Aquarium. You get an opportunity in these courses to do original research. It really teaches you not just about science, but really how to be a scientist. And students in the past have actually published research that's come out of these courses in peer-reviewed scientific journals. And another really attractive aspect of this program is now that we're really located in Boston, where formerly some of our marine program was housed at Woods Hole, down at Woods Hole, where we've developed partnerships with local marine institutions, including the New England Aquarium, the Stellwagen Bank National Marine Sanctuary, which my colleague Les has called the equivalent, the underwater equivalent of the Serengeti Plains, this massive collection of marine megafauna, and also the Sea Education Association that's down in Woods Hole. So our students, these partners help us to diversify our course offerings. They also put our students directly sort of in touch with members of the marine science community and help them sort of develop contacts going forward as well. Okay, now on to today's program entitled Footprints in the Sea. And I'm sure you recognize that the title is inspired by the well-known poem by Mary Stevenson, Footprints in the Sand. And so I'll just sort of tell you how it occurred to me. So in the poem, of course, Mary's having a dream, and she envisions 2 sets of footprints in the sand during the happier periods of her life, one belonging to herself and one belonging to the Lord. But she also notices that during the tougher times, she sees only one set of footprints. And she assumes that these footprints are her own. And that would suggest that the Lord had actually abandoned her during those tough times. So what she does is, of course, challenge him with that accusation. And so I was actually looking at this particular picture, and I was thinking, before I challenge the Lord with that particular accusation, I might suggest a simpler alternative explanation. Maybe the Lord was just strolling in the surf, which is what I might have been doing if I was in this particular situation. And so in this other picture, we can see, as we ponder today, mankind's environmental footprint on the planet. The metaphor is appropriate because it's a lot easier to see that footprint on land than it is to see it in the water. Okay, so some points I want to make as introduction. Directly or indirectly, we may not realize it or think about it often, but the world's oceans impact the well-being of every human being on the planet. So really we're thinking about the Earth as it affects humanity. And we are at the same time profoundly impacting these marine ecosystems. But we have a perspective problem that I think it's worth thinking about that causes us to not truly appreciate how reliant we are on marine ecosystems and how much we actually impact those marine ecosystems. So I want to think for a second about that. And on Earth Day, it's worth reminding ourselves that we are in fact organisms. Our welfare is inextricably linked to the biosphere then, and our health and wealth actually derive from biodiversity, including marine biodiversity. And it's very easy for we in industrialized societies to really feel somewhat divorced from nature and not intuitively sense this fact at all times. And one of the metaphors I like to think about interesting. Yes, everyone please take a moment. That's not good. Take a moment to ponder your connection to, we're going to try one more time to think about this metaphor. I'm actually going to talk about it for a second before I show it to you. The visuals are really better, but has anyone seen these glass spheres that you can buy in Brookstone called Ecospheres? They're self-enclosed ecosystems that have water. And the thing you notice from across the room even is that there are a couple of little shrimp swimming around. And it's really the ideal pet for a person like myself who's very busy, because essentially all you have to do is put it on your desk and leave it there. And I've had one for 6 years now. Actually, when I took over teaching a course in biodiversity to freshman non-science majors, we actually have a laboratory exercise where we construct one of these ecospheres and sort of test its hypotheses about its composition. And it's instructive in a few different ways. We'll see if this video plays, because it's... There we are. There's me. I have very shifty eyes. I don't like myself in this video at all. But I'm holding one of these ecospheres, and this ecosphere has been on my desk for about 6 years, as I said. I've done nothing with it, and you can see the little shrimp in there, and that's supposed to be the main attraction. But what's really attractive about this is it's actually a functioning ecosystem that I imagine contains hundreds and hundreds of species when you account for all the microbes that are in there, actually controlling the nutrient flow and the biogeochemistry, and even the microbes that are within that shrimp. We now know that microbes make up an important part of all the macroscopic animals and plants. And so we can actually think of parallels between the ecosphere and the biosphere. They're both semi-closed systems in that they're not exchanging a lot of material goods with the outside world. They both capture energy from the sun and then convert that energy into biomass. They're built upon a network of mutually interdependent species. And what's really important for today's topic is that they really both are water worlds, in that some of the most important things happen in the water. So the water helps to buffer both systems from changes in temperature, for example. The water helps to transport nutrients around these worlds, these water worlds. And all the chemistry of life really happens in water, whether it's in the seawater itself or in the water contained in our cells, which in a sense is just inherited from that original seawater. Okay. So, but I think one problem we suffer from, particularly myself, I'm an avowed sort of landlubber. I grew up in the mountains of Pennsylvania, and I don't know how I came to be in this position, but anyway, life brings you in interesting places. But for most of us, it takes a sort of effort to actually develop a marine consciousness, and I think it's not really our fault. I think it's evolution's fault, because it left us with a sort of without an intuitive ability to appreciate the marine world. We started out as vertebrates like this placoderm in the sea, of course, but a few tens of millions of years later, we ventured into freshwater, and eventually as lobe-finned fishes, we ventured out onto land. And then, of course, the early primates at the end of the Cretaceous is when the primates first appeared. This is a Dapus, but a 55-million-year-old animal that looks something like this, a tiny insect-eating arboreal animal. So our forebears were up in the trees, in the rainforest, and then later, here's Proconsul, one of the earliest apes. Of course, the apes start to descend and knuckle walk and lose the tail and things like that. And eventually, we really became, for a few million years, creatures of the savanna. We're very good at walking about on 2 feet and creating footprints in the sand, not footprints in the sea. So I think our limited perspective, in part, is not really our fault. It's just a legacy of who we are. We're bipedal apes that came from the African savanna. We're also large and terrestrial, and a lot of our interest and focus is on each other. Right? So we're the social ape, we've been called the social ape, and so much of our brain power is dedicated to thinking about each other, and we're predisposed to really focus on the here and the now, the things that might threaten us. We're also, somewhat short-lived and thinking about making it through the day, and because of that, there are things we just don't easily see, and certainly our senses are not attuned to appreciating the underwater world. We don't pay much attention to cryptic organisms or those that are underwater. We don't recognize then sometimes how dependent we are on other organisms, especially when our interactions with them are often indirect. So a lot of the oxygen we're currently breathing is the product of microbial photosynthesis in the ocean, but we don't really appreciate that. We don't need to appreciate that on a daily basis. We don't appreciate distant things necessarily, and our time scale, our time frame is really very short. So thank goodness there are people who measure things over long periods of time. Would we even know the planet was warming if someone hadn't just been taking the temperature for a period of decades? To make this more tangible, the most expansive habitat on Earth is the abyssal plain in the sea. but at least as of the writing of this, fewer people had actually visited that habitat than had visited space. And every time we go down, we just see creatures that are more fantastic than a fiction writer could imagine. So here's a deep-sea pycnogonid. Here's a deep-sea ctenophore. It's like a self-propelled set of lips that's just going around scarfing up all the plankton that's in the world. There are all kinds of spectacular deep-sea fishes that you would shock the heck out of you if you caught them from the shallows. Here's one of my favorites, the Dumbo squid. It's one of the cuter things that's down in the abyssal plain. It's even cuter as a baby. So we don't really necessarily appreciate the sea to the extent that we should. But so we have a limited sphere of perspective, but we have this very extensive sphere of influence. And so that mismatch is a real problem. And if we think about the kinds of footprints we make on the marine world, there are some that are more obvious because they're the result of us intentionally using a marine resource. And there are a lot of marine resources that we use, and I just put a few up here to remind us. We still get a fair amount of our table salt from the sea, and you can see these large evaporation operations make an obvious footprint. We get other minerals like magnesium. A large fraction of the 430,000 tons of magnesium comes from the sea. We even get fresh water from the sea. It's a very important source of this very limited resource. And of course, we exploit the sea for protein. So much of our protein actually comes from the sea. This is to give you an idea. In 2007, 143 million tons of seafood were basically harvested. $93 billion worth was exported, so it's about a $100 billion industry back in 2007. And the per capita consumption, which has been rising pretty consistently, about 17.5 kilograms or nearly 40 pounds. And you can see that these things are increasing. So we're exploiting the sea, and some of these ecosystems are out of balance with our exploitation. So here, of course, is Cape Cod. What is it hard to find in Cape Cod? Cod. They're not really commercially fished there anymore because by the 1990s, we'd essentially caused the crash of that very important, very historically important commercial fishery. It really hasn't quite recovered. So as a pitch, I would just, on Earth Day, if you haven't yet gone to the Monterey Bay Aquarium's website and gotten their seafood watch list, I think it's a great thing to do so that you could alter your diet to focus on fish that are sustainably harvested and also don't harbor mercury. Now, what's a little more troubling, because it's so indirect, are sort of the unintentional footprints we make on the sea, the sort of collateral damage. So a lot of our pollution, we're not intending to harm the sea, but so much of our plastic ends up in the sea. And we've learned just in the last 20, 30 years or so that, in fact, there are these large concentrations of plastic in certain places in the ocean, these gyres created by the surface currents. And the plastic actually gets smaller and smaller from photodegradation, but it's not really biodegraded. And it tends to serve as a magnet and concentrate toxins, which then ends up in the marine food chain. Fossil fuels are a very important footprint that we place on the marine environment. Much of the carbon that's emitted is captured in the ocean, so when you first hear it, you want to say, well, I'm glad for that. I'm glad it's not ending up in the atmosphere. But of course, it impacts the biogeochemistry of the oceans and marine biodiversity in very important ways. So we're going to hear a little bit more about this from Professor Murray. Our green fields, where does all that fertilizer, herbicide, and pesticides go? I just kept this up here because our agricultural practices have a profound impact on the biogeochemistry of the oceans and marine biodiversity ultimately. And I can understand that. One thing that I actually am railing against as a suburban homeowner is our obsession with lawn, with Kentucky bluegrass. Why do we have to all have green carpets outside of our house? My neighbors are a little irritated about me because my yard doesn't look like that. So what do we need to do then to identify our footprints in the sea, especially the ones that are a little more indirect and not so obvious? Things that faculty here at BU are doing and things that we're trying to teach our marine science students to sense more broadly, use what's called remote sensing to sort of appreciate a much larger scale what's occurring. To take the long view in terms of time, so think about paleoceanography and climatological history and how these things change over time so that we could recognize when are we just looking at a natural short-term variation and when are we seeing a significant trend. We need to get in the water more, and that means also traveling the surface of the water, more oceanography, and as Les is going to show us, there's no substitute for just getting in the water at some of these sites and seeing with your own eyes what's going on. We need to delve inside the organisms with some of the new technologies we have, including genomic technologies, and ask, in a way, the organisms to tell us what's wrong with the marine environment. And we really need to take an interdisciplinary approach. We need to see the same environment, but from different perspectives. So one of the things our program tries to emphasize is we need to look at the biology, the chemistry of the sea, the physical oceanography, and also the marine geology and how they all act collectively to impact the state of the environment. So with that, I'm going to introduce then Professor Murray, who's going to talk to us about carbon, climate, and ocean acidification.
Hi, everybody. Thanks. That's me. That was actually taken on the dock at St. Croix for some of you students out there from our Caribbean trips. I'm going to be sort of talking about some of the same stuff that John started off with, and in particular, emphasizing some of the aspects of time. And my talk is sort of broken down into two portions. For the first 5 minutes, I'm going to very, very, very rapidly go through a series of slides showing you how scientists know what we know about climate change and about the role of the oceans and the role of the atmosphere and the linking between the atmosphere and the ocean. And what that tells us about climate change, because that gives us the perspective, as Finnerty just said, of understanding if what we're seeing today is a natural perturbation or not. And then I'm going to briefly talk in turn about some of the human impacts or the impacts on humans from sea level rise and melting of the ice caps. And then I'm going to go into very briefly a little sojourn into ocean acidification. So with that sort of context of where I'm going, this is a famous slide. In fact, John showed it. This is the blue marble. It's a composite photograph from NASA. But as you know, the Earth's surface is 70% water, and astronauts from looking at it from out of space, clearly it's this beautiful blue glass marble in a sea of black space. And the role of water is absolutely enormously important. Several perspectives from the Earth. This is my favorite ocean because I work here mostly. But you can see, essentially, from some perspectives, half of the Earth. You just see ocean, not land at all. So Earth is, of course, misnamed. The ocean, in addition to being intrinsically interesting in and of itself, it provides a record for us of past changes in volcanism. Dust storms coming off of Africa, for example. That's the Iberian Peninsula, and this is Western Africa. That's a dust storm coming off the Sahara. And also biological activity. The colors here show the range of marine primary production. The bright colors show high primary productivity, and the blues show low primary productivity. So the ocean is a very diverse biological, geological, climatological entity in and of itself, and it provides a very interesting record of all this. Speaking of records, how do we know what changes have been in the past, and how do the oceans help us in this? Well, oceanographers like myself, we go out to sea on ships. We take marine cores, which is basically a long tube that we lower on wires down to the seafloor and pick up layers of ocean mud. We bring them back up to the surface. Here are some colleagues of ours. Whoops, that's not the pointer. Looking at one of these cores that we take out. You can cut it in half, look at them, study the very different layers in there. They tell us things like this is a volcanic ash layer that you can see right through here. So that's an event. This particular one's about 35 million years old. That's a volcanic event far away, and you can clearly see exactly how volcanism, which potentially affects climate, has changed through time. Here are some other layers. These happen to be changes in biological production through time, one of the chemical products thereof. And some of these, when you look really up close, you can see almost annual layering showing productivity increasing and productivity decreasing. The oceans also tell us a fair bit about the atmosphere, and also what tells us a lot about the atmosphere are the records trapped in ice. So simultaneously, while a bunch of us like me are going out and spending months of our lives at sea, there are other people, primarily atmospheric chemists, who go out into the ice caps, such as in Antarctica, and they look at layers of ice, looking at the trapped atmosphere that's included in the ice as it turns from snow into the glaciers itself. And you can actually see very finely there the nice little layers. So these people go out on the ice where it's really cold, and they take cores. They also dig pits. These are people down here dressed in chemistry gear because the ice is very, very clean and they want to make sure they don't contaminate it so they can study what they do. A whole series of other people. These are my personal heroes because these people are tough. I go to sea on a boat. We take all our equipment on a boat. Those other people go out on the glaciers and it gets flown in. These are the people that go up and look at ice up in the high alpine peaks. They carry their drill rigs with them, as you can see, climbing up a ladder. Clearly high elevation with their drill rigs here. Extracting ice cores, as you can see from this. That's their home for months on end. They take it back. Here's an ice core. This is shown exactly the way the sediment cores I showed you earlier on. So there's us looking at sediments and our colleagues looking at ice. And what does all this science tell us? I went through that very, very briefly, but to show you that the discussions about global warming and climate change that involve the ocean are based on thousands and thousands of scientists looking at ocean records, atmosphere records, other terrestrial records, and putting it all together. And so what does all this science tell us about our blue planet and the role of water? One of the very, very key things to remember is that the ocean, our beloved ocean, is the largest reservoir of carbon that's relevant to human timescales. All the hullabaloo about global warming and atmospheric carbon dioxide change is focusing on this 600 gigatons of carbon up in the atmosphere. Out in the vegetation, so this is the trees and berries and shrubbery and all that sort of thing. And the soils, those are pretty big numbers. They're roughly the same scale as the atmosphere. Of course, it's pretty easy for a tree to affect atmospheric CO2. The upper ocean, again, roughly the same scale. This is where a lot of the biological productivity is going on. It's pretty easy to affect that. But the deep ocean, 38,000 gigatons of carbon. So this thing has a hiccup, and it's going to absolutely affect atmospheric CO2 very, very easily. And the kicker here is the ocean circulates on a 1,000-year time scale, which is exactly the time scale that we're seeing natural climate change. This, even more enormous, giganto-enormous number, 66 million gigatons, that's tied up in sediment and rocks, and that's very important over long time frames. But in the last 10 years, there hasn't been appreciable global weathering changes of that 66 million. But there's probably been appreciable changes in this exchange and certainly in this exchange as well. Now, we couldn't have done this graph 40 years ago. In fact, you look at the publications 40 years ago, and these numbers are all completely different. All right, so this is one of the major things that we've learned recently. Now, how does that tie into the atmospheric CO2 again? Well, here we've got, here we've got, roughly calendar year, and here we've got the measurements. These are made in the atmosphere on top of Hawaii of atmospheric carbon dioxide. And you can see that these measurements made since the 1950s tie in exactly with those ice core measurements that I showed you being taken earlier on. And I want you to remember this 290, 280 number right here. So this is really critical because this ties things that we've measured versus things that are trapped in bubbles. When you go back even further in time, 200,000 years, and trust me, this goes back now to 800,000 years, and here's the atmosphere change carbon dioxide. Here's a temperature scale. You can see that there's just visually a very close change between the change in atmospheric carbon dioxide and the temperature of the atmosphere. All right, you don't have to be a rocket scientist to see this. You don't need any fancy statistics, although they help. It's just very, very clear right there, that first order change. And this CO2 does not exceed that 290 parts per million over this natural cycles up here. So you go back 200,000 years or all the way back to 800,000 years, and you got that 290. And when you go back here, look, here we are up at 370. In fact, it's changed since this slide was made, which you'll see in a second. Here's a sort of a summary graph that I put together from a bunch of things, and I don't expect you to read all the details, but it's an important graph nonetheless. This is essentially the same graph that I just showed you. So here's 400,000 years. One of these, I can't tell which, because A, I'm colorblind, and B, I'm way over here at the end of the slide. I can't, at a bad angle. One of these is carbon dioxide, one of these is temperature, but they're so on top of each other it doesn't really matter. When you blow up this last diagram right here and you go back to the year 1000 or so, again, carbon dioxide, we've got ice cores from a bunch of different sources mapping right on in. And then down here is the temperature change since 1850, showing this dramatic increase as well. There's ups and downs. We don't understand all the ups and downs, but it's undeniable. And then you look here, 2010 or 2009 when this one is, and it's up at 386, and this is going up by about a ppm a year or even more than that. So when you look at the natural cycles of carbon dioxide, it's maxed out at 290. There's the 290 or so right here, and it's gone up. And in fact, since then, it's gone, that arrow is where we are now. Much higher than anything we can see in the natural cycle. Okay? In terms of what we understand, what we don't understand, and I apologize if this might hit a little too close to home to some people, but people ask me, for an analogy, okay, we don't understand climate change, it's too risky, let's not affect the economy. Well, the analogy I say, and it's a very, very, very good analogy, is we don't understand cancer. Okay? We don't understand all the ins and outs about cancer whatsoever, but it's very, very clear cancer is a risk, cancer is happening, it kills people. We don't understand everything about global warming. It's happening. We don't understand all the perturbations. We don't understand all the mechanisms, but it's clearly happening. Okay? All right, so what are some of the planetary effects of this climate change? How does it affect us, and how do we affect it? So as I said, I'm going to talk very briefly about sea level change and then ocean acidification. I hope this shows up. This is Boston. We are right out here. Okay, I was very pleased that the website that I grabbed these from actually shows BU, and they truncated out BC, which is appropriate. Okay, here's Boston today, which is 0 meter change of sea level from today. And here it is. Does that show in terms of the colors? Okay, you can see what happens when sea level goes up 7 meters. Now, why 7 meters? If you melt Greenland, sea level is going to rise 7 meters. Greenland could melt in as short a time as 150 to 200 years. Some people postulate on the shorter side, some people maybe 250, 300 years. That's not a long time ago, okay? It might seem a long time for us or in terms of presidential election cycles, but a couple hundred years ago, we had people here. Boston existed, Tremont Street existed, the Boston Common existed, and in 200 years from now, if Greenland goes, they're not going to exist anymore. Now, if you melt Antarctica, it's going to go up 80 meters. I couldn't really find an 80-meter example on this website, but here's 14 meters, all right, which is pretty dramatic change as to what's going to happen here. And I'm not just mentioning Boston because it's our home, but it's a good indicator of what's going on. Here's Florida at 14 meters. All right, you can see the real coastline today, and this is the 14-meter coastline. God bless you. This is the 14-meter coastline. All right, right there. Let's go a little larger. Let's go up to that 100 meters. Here in red, this is the coastline of the U.S., flooding, ice melting with 100 meters. And so you can see that the coastlines dramatically change. Here it is again, coming up on the U.S. seaboard. This is all gone, and so on and so forth. Now, some people might say it's a little hard to really sort of articulate or envision, okay, well, so it goes up, so what? People can move and all that. And John told a sort of quasi-biblical story, so I'll tell my little biblical story here. Kind of reminds me of that old joke about how Noah was questioning God about whether Noah really needs to take all this time to build that ark. Can he just kind of, deal with it and migrate? And God says, well, how long can you tread water? And that's sort of the indicator that I use. 100 meters is well over my head. 7 meters is well over my head. And humanity over the 100 or 200 or 300 year, it would be pretty hard to migrate humanity in such a scale, looking at what we know here in terms of the coastlines. In fact, anybody know what that number is? Number of people that live on the coast. Global percent population within 20 miles of the coastline, 40%. Okay? And that is also, the number climbs to 50% when you say 50% of the globe lives in elevations less than 100 meters. All right? So this graph there on the global basis, that's half the people right now. All right? Some part of me sort of secretly hopes it happens in more rapid time frames, because if you think about it, this is going to wipe out virtually all the infrastructure that we have right now that's carbon-based infrastructure, and it's going to force us to build whole new power systems over the 500-year timescale. But that's sort of a silly thing to wish for, of course. All right. So sea level change, obviously, I mean, and you look back, John, when you're showing all your footprint slides, one way of looking at this is, here is humanity's footprint right here, and there's the ocean coming in and wiping it right out. Okay? Different type of footprint, but larger scale. All right, acidification of the ocean. This has been studied over the last 10 or 15 years. We who sort of are associated with this field are pleased to see that it's starting to gain traction. It's starting to be known as the other CO2 problem because sea level rise has received so much attention and justifiably so. But now ocean acidification is entering the common lexicon. This is a report that came out in June 2006, sponsored by everybody who sponsors things. This is a report that came out today. Ocean Acidification National Strategy pre-publication copy. I just got the email with this, so I said, well, that's convenient. There you have it. This is the first conclusion of that paper that I just showed you. All right, the very first conclusion in the executive summary chartered by the National Academy of Sciences. Chemistry of the ocean is changing, unprecedented rate, due to anthropogenic carbon dioxide emissions. Period. It's not saying maybe, it's not saying perhaps, it is. Rate of change exceeds any known to have occurred for the past hundreds of thousands of years. That sort of speaks back to some of those other graphs I had. Unless something is done, average pH will continue to fall, has demonstrated impacts on organisms. Ultimate consequences still unknown. Risk of ecosystem changes that threaten coral reefs, fisheries, protected species, and other natural resources of value to society. John was talking about fishing and all this other stuff as well. So what is ocean acidification? This is your one and only chemistry slide. But there's atmospheric CO2. By now you understand the CO2 is going up and down and we're causing it. We are causing it. Air-sea exchange puts some of that CO2 into the ocean. It goes through what's called the carbonate buffer, or here in Boston, the carbonate buffer. And long and the short of it is, you get down here, you're adding carbon dioxide into the system. This is the mineral calcite, which is what coral reefs and many other organisms are made out of, and you dissolve them there, coral reefs and everything else. What's affected? Some big things that you can actually look at and see, and there's pictures all through here. These are calcite-secreting organisms, and all the biologists in the audience know more about these things than I do. I just eat one of these. But lobsters are affected as well. And what you don't see, but that I care about as a scientist looking at global change, are plankton that end up landing on the seafloor and giving us our record of global change and so on. But what you see here are some of the largest photosynthesizers in the oceans that are the natural cycle, that are the base of the food chain. And so all these organisms here, they make their shells out of this element or this mineral right here. And so therefore they are going to be dramatically affected by the fact that we're pumping CO2 into the atmosphere, it's going into the ocean, going down through here and dissolving. And so we are fundamentally affecting the food chain in an interesting way, not just at the bottom, but we're affecting it in the mid-levels, the tops, and the bottoms sort of all throughout. Okay? Again, today was a great day. Obviously, this all came out on Earth Day for a reason, but when we talk about not just being of academic, which some might say is esoteric interest, we're talking about major industry in the United States. Ocean acidification hits Northwest oyster farms, blah, 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 blah. You go to this on ABC News, that bastion of credibility. You can even click on this and it gets you to all sorts of stuff. And they noticed over the last couple years, so over our time scale, not hundreds of years, not hundreds of thousands of years, but dying larvae or depleting oysters and other shellfish, etc. So my take-home messages before I hand this on over to, I think Wally is next, or Professor Fulweiler is next. The CO2 increases that we're observing on our blue marble are real, and they are unlike anything seen before. They are not a natural cycle. You're going to hear the skeptics say, oh, it's just a natural cycle. They're wrong. Period. Sea level rise. That's going to affect 40% of the global population. That's a lot of people. Huge impact on demographics, infrastructure, et cetera, et cetera. And while this, some might say, is a long-term problem, maybe mankind can adapt over hundreds and hundreds of years, although that's quite a challenge. Ocean acidification is a problem right now. It's got the chemical reactions act fast enough that this is something we need to worry about right now, immediately. Not only our generation, but like us today, the scientists that we have today. So that's my sort of overall introduction to give a large scale. As John Finnerty just said, Professor Fulweiler and Les Kaufman are going to talk more about other aspects, focusing in on the coastlines and nutrient cycling and coral reefs and biodiversity issues along these lines. I hope I've given you sort of a feel for the time domain as well as the spatial domain and some of the primary drivers of the impact of humanity on marine and coastal ecosystems. Thank you. Wally, or anybody have any questions or comments? Feel free, or we can talk later, or you can now wake up and listen to Wally. All right, Wally, I'll get you going here. Backwards, forwards.
Okay.
Once you turn it around, it looks like it's the other way.
I'll mess that up 100 times.
Yeah, it took me about halfway.
Okay, thank you guys very much. I think you set this up very well. This is kind of funky to look at this. Okay. So I'm going to talk to you today about one of my most favorite topics ever, which makes me a giant nerd, and I'll acknowledge that now. And I think if you come to hear a marine talk, you may be, I don't know, maybe when you think of the ocean, you think of these things, right? You think of a breaching whale or a pod of dolphins, or perhaps you're thinking of that awesome tropical vacation when you got to snorkel, or if you're feeling sort of cynical, Jaws, you know. And all of these things are dynamic and charismatic megafauna, and in truth, I'm a bit jealous because the things I study, I can't see with the unaided eye. In fact, a lot of them I can't see unless I do some sort of weird chemical reaction and look at a chemical change. And so all of the things, essentially what you're looking at here is my jealousy. I could show you molecular compounds, but that doesn't really, it's not really a crowd pleaser. So the important thing to remember is that nutrients, which I'll talk to you about today, so things like nitrogen and phosphorus, carbon and silica, and I'll focus on nitrogen, while they're tiny and not very charismatic, without them, none of these would be possible. So all of the ecosystems really start from this base here. Okay, so Rick talked a little bit about phytoplankton, and I'm not sure if you can see this, but here, if you could, this is the coast of Washington, and there's a light color here. And phytoplankton are known, right, they're microscopic plants. They're known as the grass of the sea, and phytoplankton means an aimless wanderer, which is not quite true, but it's sort of true because they sort of go with the tides. Now I'm showing you here phytoplankton, my favorite group, again highlighting my nerdiness. I have a favorite group of phytoplankton, and these are diatoms, right? The silica-based small microscopic plants. And the key to realize here is that when phytoplankton bloom, right, when they reach this giant capacity in biomass, you can see them all the way from space, like the satellite photo shows. And if you were to go and grab some water and maybe look at this under the microscope, you would see these beautiful and diverse types of phytoplankton. And these are my favorite, not just because they're beautiful, which you can see they are, but because if I was in the ocean and I was hungry and I was a vegetarian, I would eat these. Diatoms are delicious and nutritious, and if you think about it, they're kind of like the 5-star Michelin restaurant, okay? These are the things you want to eat. And if you think about food webs that you're kind of familiar with, those that produce lots of commercial species that we're interested in, these are diatom-based food webs, okay? So this is kind of it. So how do you make a diatom? Well, you make a diatom the same way you'd make a plant on Earth, and you need nitrogen to do it. Now, you need other things too, but in truth, the major, what we call limiting nutrient, and you all probably know this intuitively, and some of you in my class should know this for the final, the limiting nutrient, right, organisms need sort of ingredients to grow, and plants, whether it be on land or in the sea, they need sunlight, and they need nutrients like nitrogen and phosphorus. And it turns out that typically marine systems are limited by nitrogen. And this is also true whether, so there's our diatoms again, but it's also true if you're growing corn in Iowa, you need a lot of nitrogen, or as John pointed out, if you're trying to make that really green, grassy lawn, you're going to need nitrogen to do it, okay? And for animals,
Yes, nitrogen is needed for animals. For this beautiful whale here, you see I'm showing you the charismatic megafauna. If you're on land and you're a cow, you also need nitrogen. And so every time we try to grow any crops, right, and then feed any of the animals that some of us like to eat, we need more nitrogen. And then, of course, you know ourselves, we're in fact animals. And just a little fun fact for you all, sitting here right now, you are about 3% nitrogen by weight. So that's kind of fun. Okay, so 3% of you is nitrogen. And we need nitrogen for a variety of things, and there's nothing that we can do about it, okay? We need nitrogen. John wanted me to tell you that's him. We need nitrogen, right, to grow muscles, to make amino acids, to make DNA and RNA. Nitrogen's key, and it's true for all organisms. And there's nothing we can do, and as I kind of point out here, we're not going to genetically engineer ourselves to be different, and we're not going to probably do that for cows either, although it's kind of a neat idea. But so we need nitrogen to survive, and whether you're a man or a woman, you need about somewhere between 5 to 8 grams of nitrogen per day, which we get through protein. And I want you just to put that in the back of your head right now, okay, and hold on to that fact. So because we need so much nitrogen, we've learned different ways to manipulate the nitrogen cycle globally. Before we came along, the nitrogen cycle was fairly simple as far as cycles go. Nitrogen's complex, but we had, and today still, right, the biggest amount of nitrogen is in the atmosphere, right? Our atmosphere is about 80% N2, and then we've got other pools more moving around in the ocean and soils and whatnot, but by far, our atmosphere, 80% nitrogen, and most of this can't be used by organisms, okay? So it's what we call a biologically unavailable form of nitrogen. Now, you're thinking, well, I know some guys can do this, and you're right. On land, things like clover, right, and potatoes, so legumes, things that have symbiotic relationships with bacteria can actually fix nitrogen. And what I mean by that is there are bacteria that take this dinitrogen N2 gas and put it into their biomass and make it into ammonium. And once they do that, that's a form that's biologically available and can suddenly move around the environment. And if you look here, right, this is if you pulled up a legume, you would find these little white blobs or nodules, and in there are the bacteria that are doing this fixing of nitrogen. Other than that, lightning strikes like we had this afternoon can actually fix nitrogen. They tend to make nitrates, not ammoniums. But regardless, before humans came along, we had about 140 teragrams of nitrogen, so a good amount, but not that much. And you can think of it that we were kind of limited by nitrogen too at this point, because if we could cultivate these crops, but that was kind of it. We could go use manure to fertilize our fields or get guano deposits off of islands, but that was it. We were limited by what was there already. However, we have dramatically changed this. So, you know that CO2 curve that Rick showed you, right? So if I did my math right, and that's always fuzzy, the CO2 has increased about 25% globally, right? But if we look at in terms of nitrogen, we've increased it way more, and we've done it in a variety of different ways. So we've cultivated nitrogen-fixing crops like those potatoes I showed you, or soybeans. We burn biomass. We tend to do that, right, for fuel, but mainly for clearing fields for agriculture. We burn fossil fuels, all of this adding nitrogen to the world. But by far, the largest amount of nitrogen addition has been through fertilizer. And we learned to do this, right, in 1918, the HaberBosch process. We learned to fix nitrogen out of the atmosphere at high temperature and pressure and turn it in from N2 gas to ammonium. And by doing that, we have rapidly increased the amount of nitrogen cycling in the globe. So if we look here, early 1950s, really dramatic increase, okay? And in fact, natural sources before, about 140 teragrams, human sources have N about 210. The key thing to remember here is that we've basically almost doubled the amount of nitrogen cycling in the biosphere in less than 100 years. That's right, we've doubled it, okay? So that's amazing. And if we look at this, because we were limited by nutrient, it turns out that by 2008, 40% of the global population was alive because of this. Without fertilizer, we would not be able to have crops that were productive enough to keep ourselves alive. So this is kind of a conundrum, because I'm certainly not going to tell someone, sorry, you guys can't eat, Sorry for you, okay, because we're not going to stop making nitrogen. So this is a big problem. We need it to survive. We've increased it a lot. We've doubled the amount, and 48% of the global population is alive today because of this process. Lots of increase. Okay. So what does this mean? Well, it turns out that nitrogen is, frankly, a promiscuous molecule, okay? It likes to get around. And what I mean by that is it's true. Once nitrogen form comes out of that N2 form and into a form like ammonium or nitrate, it can move through the system, some of those easier than others. And when it moves to the system, you guys all know that old saying, right? We all live downstream, and this is absolutely true for nitrogen. So the nitrogen that we put on our farm fields, the nitrogen that we expel in wastewater treatment, the nitrogen that you put on your green lawns, do not get a green lawn this year, it all makes it to the coastal waters. And then there's a variety of negative consequences. So I feel these talks are a little bit depressing today, but we'll see what I can do. Okay, so what are some of the negative consequences? Eelgrass, right, the dominant species around here is Zostera marina. It's a really beautiful submerged aquatic vegetation. It's a land plant that's basically made its way to evolve underneath and live in marine systems. It needs a certain amount of light to be able to photosynthesize and live. It provides really essential and important habitat for a bunch of commercial species that we like, both finfish and shellfish. And it can also protect against erosion. So lots of good things come from eelgrass, not to mention that it's very pretty. And when you dump a lot of nitrogen, remember nitrogen's that limiting nutrient, so suddenly the phytoplankton, they have light, maybe they have phosphorus, you add a lot of nitrogen and they really start to bloom. And you can have different types of phytoplankton blooms, or you can have things like epiphytes, right, a plant growing on the eelgrass, or macroalgae growing on top of this eelgrass. And essentially it shades the plant out and will outcompete the plant for nutrients and light, and then the eelgrass dies. And unfortunately, these kind of epiphytes and macroalgae are not very good habitat for species, and they don't do anything for erosion. The other negative thing is that when you give, and you probably know this from at home if you ever fertilized, when you give plants a lot of nitrogen, they grow lots and lots of shoots and not so many roots. And so if a big storm comes along, then they're really top heavy and they can get ripped out and moved along, and you lose a lot of the eelgrass beds. Okay? Nitrogen's bad for eelgrass. How about in terms of just algal production in general? So again, you give phytoplankton lots of nitrogen and you create these large blooms of organic matter. And these can go in two different ways that are negative. For one thing, you can make harmful algal blooms. You guys know harmful algal blooms, right? Cause a variety of issues for other organisms. Here's an example on the coast of Washington. Here's an example here in Florida. You see the nice blue greenish water. All of that dark cloud, that's a red tide. That happens when you change the ratio of nutrients, right? The ratios of nitrogen to phosphorus to silica coming into a coastal system. And this can lead to a series of bad things. For one thing, a lot of these species are less nutritious. These are not the 5-star Michelin. These are the worst, McDonald's or something, okay? Some horrible McDonald's, which I actually like sometimes. But you know my point, okay? So that's one thing. They're not nutritious. They disrupt the food web. So all of those organisms, those whales, right, that eventually depend on what grew on the phytoplankton, you affect all of the species all the way up the food chain. In addition, you can change biodiversity because some species don't want to eat harmful algal blooms. Some of these blue phytoplankton are actually they're made differently, right? They're smaller, they're less labile and delicious, and they actually have structures on them that make them difficult for filter-feeding organisms to eat, and they can actually clog the filtering filtering, I can't losing the word. What the organism uses for filtering actually can get clogged by these phytoplankton. So all around these cause issues. In addition, some harmful algal blooms are harmful to higher species because they produce different poisons. So they can be harmful to us, they can be harmful to birds and other organisms that are eating them because they actually make some sort of poison. In addition, all of those phytoplankton blooms, at some point they have to die, right? And when they do, they fall to the bottom and they decompose. And the bacteria that are doing that decomposition first are aerobic bacteria, and that is they're going to use up the oxygen in the water column. And so when they do that, any organisms, like this is a bunch of shellfish here, any sessile organisms that can't get out of the way are in trouble. They can't move, there's no oxygen for them to breathe, and so they die. They essentially suffocate and die. Depending on where you are and if you have an enclosed environment, even fish can't get out, and so here's all different examples of fish here's these fish caught in a macroalgae bloom, and these are ones washed up against the dock and washed up against the shore. So if they get caught in this low oxygen environment, they too die. And this all stems from adding too much nitrogen. And unfortunately, this slide is not looking that great here, but you guys can see that this is a picture of the globe at night, and this is a famous photograph. And what you see is all of these lights, right? And you can see, just as Rick was highlighting, right, 40% of the population is living on the coast, and you can see that quite clearly here. There's a big group here and a big group here in the US. And if we want to overlay on top of that where low oxygen conditions are happening, and again, that's because of the phytoplankton falling out, decomposing, if we overlay that map on top of it, you can see all these warm colors are areas of concern. And again, the areas of concern for low oxygen conditions are these areas that have lots of people living on them. Because where you have lots of people, you always have lots of nitrogen. And so I don't want to be entirely depressing. Instead, I want to tell you that there are things you can do. So you cannot fertilize your lawn. There's no need to keep up with the Joneses. You do not need a green lawn. So you don't have to fertilize that. We can do different things like change our diet a little bit. All of that would help if we ate kind of less meat. We had more Mediterranean diet. You don't have to give it up entirely, but just less meat in general would stop the need for putting lots of nutrients on farm fields. It shouldn't be entirely depressing because there are options that we can do and things that we can do in the future. And I think that's it. So thank you very much.
Hello, everybody. I'm glad to have just returned from the savage prairies of Texas. How do we just go like that? That's me. That's frightening. All right. So let's see. Rick told us that 40% of the human population lives near, it's going to be drowned. And Wally told us that the proportion of the population we need to get rid of is 40%. But I am a creature of hope. And what I want to do today is tell you a hopeful story. This magnificent assemblage here is butterfly fishes. Whoops. Oh, what did I do? Ooh. It went extinct. What do you do now? What? Oh, wait, I think I know.
I think you just
Go back.
yeah, hit play.
Play. Where's play?
Right there. There you go.
I like to play.
So there must be a
What?
button there that can,
Okay, all right. So anyway, let's try going back. Yeah, all right. These are butterfly fish, which have an obligate relationship. In other words, they need to live. The coral that they're picking mucus off of, they're not hurting the coral. And this association between beautifully colored fishes and living coral is what draws people who have the luxury of doing so to travel to the tropics to see coral reefs. And we tend to forget, living up here in the Northern Hemisphere, that coral reefs shelter 10% of the world's warm water coastlines and are absolutely essential for supporting a huge proportion of humanity. As I'm going to explain to you in a moment, coral reefs are in very, very serious trouble. And one of the problems we have is not knowing what they should look like, because the last time coral reefs looked the way they should in the Caribbean, even almost, was when I was an undergraduate student, and that is a frightfully long time ago. And nowadays, when students see coral reefs, they have no idea what they're supposed to look like, and that was in 30 years. That's really, really scary. The problem we're dealing with is that, you know what a hotspot is, biological hotspot? Norman Myers, Russ Mittermeier, and a bunch of other famous biology types proposed this concept several decades ago that if you want to conserve most of the living species on Earth, you really don't have to save that much of the Earth. You just have to go to the places where the greatest number of species are concentrated and the greatest number are at risk. That's called a hotspot. But the greatest of all hotspots on Earth is that thin margin of coastline running around the tropics. It captures an enormous amount of Earth's diversity. but it's also where all these people live. And the greater part of the people living in that zone are needy or desperate right now. And in that zone, because the Earth is so dynamic now, the goalposts keep shifting. It's hard to know what to do because things are changing so rapidly. This is a graph of the decline of coral reefs since just the 60s or 70s as measured by the amount of living coral on the surface in the Caribbean, in the Great Barrier Reef, and Indonesia. This is real. And look at the axis. You're losing 20 to 40% of the live coral cover in that period of time. It's not only coral reefs that we're losing. Along this same narrow margin are mangrove tree communities, and these are the hyper-diverse assemblages of invertebrates and algae living on the roots of the mangroves. Almost all the living animal phyla are represented in 1 square meter of mangrove root. This is a littoral forest just above the mangroves in Australia. That forest is almost gone. This is a tropical swamp forest in Dominica. Again, almost all of this is gone. Now, the way that coral reefs in particular are disappearing is similar around the world. Basically, you go from a lot of live hard coral, this is the Caribbean, this is the Pacific, to a sort of bleak landscape dominated by seaweed and sponges. This is the Atlantic, that's the Pacific. So this is exactly the story that Professor Fulweiler was telling us, unfolding on a scale of awful majesty. The way that it's happening is very similar around the world. In order to make a punchy message, a group of us, as part of something called the Shifting Baselines campaign, thought that it would be better than showing pictures to get industrial light and magic to make drawings, because kids would respond to it more. Well, I don't know if I believe that, but this is what a coral reef looks like today in a place like Jamaica. This is what it looked like in 1960. This is not an exaggeration. So what disappeared between these two times? Well, big groupers, all big predators, like this reef shark, certainly the amount of live coral, and see these black spiny things? Those are sea urchins. All the species that eat seaweed and algae that can outcompete coral for space are largely what disappeared, along with the big predators. Now, you can go on a website called www.shiftingbaselines.org, and if you look around, you'll find a symphony orchestra led by Jack Black. And the idea is that, well, the orchestra plays, and it is horrible. It's the worst orchestra in the world. And you're supposed to get the connection. The connection is, Jack Black turns to you and says, you would never tolerate such music. Why do you tolerate the ocean the way it is today? I don't know how many people really, that's a bit of a jump. But the point is made. We are not used to the way things should be. We need to have a reawakening, a reminder that this is what it's supposed to look like. We could have so much more with just a little bit of effort. You? Come. Okay, so one of the major problems we're facing is that there's a synergy of global and local forces tearing away at the fabric of this thin line of tropical shore. And we've heard a lot about what's going on globally. The 4 horsemen of the climate change apocalypse are bleaching and acidification. Bleaching is thermal, it's too hot. The warming causes corals to spit up the algae that are symbiotic and allow them to grow. Acidification, increased intensity of storms, and rising sea level. And these work together to annihilate coastal communities. But at the same time, these same organisms are having to contend with coastal pollution, as described by Dr. Fulweiler, and massive overfishing, massive over-extraction of biomass from the ocean. So what do you do about it? Globally, we need to fight global climate change, which means initially reducing CO2 emissions. How do you do that? You put words on a big placard and you walk up and down in front of the UN. You become an international diplomat. You do stuff like that. But the other one, stop overfishing and stop all that nitrogen from going into coastal waters, that's something we actually can do ourselves. All of us collectively, all around the world. And the question is, what is the marginal benefit of the things that we can do locally? And is it enough to make a difference? If it isn't, that is a very depressing story. So, along with Conservation International, 6 professors here at BU, and 104 or so others 5 years ago, we started a program to answer that question. Can local conservation efforts make enough of a difference to steel society and marine ecosystems against the immediate onslaught of global climate change? What do we have to work with? Well, most coral reefs around the world look like this now. Dead coral covered by algae, but some are in transition back to health. There are areas that look like this. Dead coral, but live coral. In a few precious spots that we're tracking as if they were the last life in the universe. We know where they are. We don't tell many people. It looks like this again. There is an enormous vibrancy, an enormous resilience and hope that these systems can be brought back, but we have to know what we're trying to bring them back to. We have to have these reference points. So what we have today is a harlequin seascape, a mosaic of tragedy and hope as you look around. We have to discover where the shreds of hope are and focus on bringing the rest of the world to that point. And it can be done. In order to set that baseline again, in order to set the bar that we want to reach, we traveled in September 2009 to arguably the most remote place on Earth, the Phoenix Islands in the nation of Kiribati, in the middle of that blue half of the world that you saw on an earlier slide. And in this place, when you get in the water, the end of the dive is decided not by when you run out of air, but by when the sharks tell you it's time to leave. And that is the way the whole ocean is supposed to look. So we went to this place. We looked at the corals. This is Randy Rochen of the New England Aquarium. This was a combined aquarium, Conservation International, National Geographic, Explorers Club, Boston University, everyone who could fit on a boat. This is Randy measuring coral in one of the areas of the Phoenix Island that looked very beautiful. And this is me looking at fish, probably asleep. I'm supposed to be counting them. It's a very relaxing environment. This is an area where the Phoenix Islands don't have a lot of live coral. We'll get to that in a minute. Okay. What I did as part of this larger project called the Marine Management Area Science Program, which was benevolently funded by the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation. Gordon, the founder of Intel, likes fish. What we did is say, let's go to the Central Pacific Ocean, the most remote and pristine part of the ocean in the tropics, and let's remember what the ocean should look like. But let's do it a few different ways. Let's take a number of examples. In the Northern Line Islands, which I forget what the old British name for them is. But anyway, in the Northern Line Islands, we actually found a gradient of human impacts from Christmas Island that has 8,000 people on it to Palmyra, places like that that are almost deserted. There has been some impact, but they're almost deserted. And we looked at how the reef looks different. This is an expedition led by Enrique Sala of National Geographic. This is Kingman's Atoll, one of the most remote and pristine coral reefs on Earth. Huge sharks, lots of coral, the tan stuff, lots of coral and algae, the pink stuff, a hard algae that corals like to grow on. The baby corals go on that. And as you move from an uninhabited island to a heavily inhabited island, there is a series of highly predictable transitions that you can see in time or in space as you move toward that dense human population. At this end, no fish at all, very, very few fish, mostly this weedy algae very similar to what Professor Fulweiler was talking about. In between, interesting things happen. When the sharks are all gone, you get an explosion of small fish because nobody's eating them. It's called a trophic cascade. So we got our gradient from the Northern Line Islands, and we created an index that I'll explain in a moment called Chi, the life force, the life breath, but it actually stands for Coral Health Index. The next place we went is the Southern Line Islands. The Southern Line Islands are still absolutely pristine. Nothing has really hit them hard recently. And that was just to know what it really would look like if there was nothing bad going on. And then finally, the subject of right now, the Phoenix Islands. The Phoenix Islands may be known to you only as the place where Amelia Earhart disappeared. There were stories that she crashed on Nicomaroro Island, and I could tell you those stories. And someone found a woman's shoe and a part of a bra. Actually, we went around the beaches a lot on the Phoenix Islands because we prize those Japanese glass floats that hold the illegal drift nets up. And we'd go all over looking for glass floats. And what we discovered most of the time was essentially a ladies' lingerie section of all kinds of like underwear and flip-flops. And so I don't think anyone would know whose was Amelia Earhart's. But anyway, that's where the Phoenix Islands are. And the point of going there is that the Phoenix Islands were pristine in 2002. What we discovered, first, before we go to the Phoenix Islands, what we discovered in the Line Islands is that with just a few measurements, we could tell how healthy a reef was, and we could compare a coral reef anywhere in the world. And what we found is that all you have to do is measure fish biomass, particularly the top predators, the black in these bars, and you'll see as you go from no people to lots of people, a very steep decline. The other thing you lose are herbivorous fishes. If you look at benthos, these are graphs of corals of different sizes, and the number of baby corals, the replacement generation, no people, lots of people. But the most exciting were the microbes. Forrest Rowe of the University of San Diego did genomic assays of the microbes in the water here and found as you went from no people to lots of people, not only did the concentration of bacteria go up exponentially, but there was a change in the community from prochlorococci, which are the most abundant cell in the world. They're a good blue-green algae or cyanobacteria that occurs in all the oceans of the world, but only in clean water. And they were replaced by a bestiary of bacteria called Vibrio. The most famous Vibrio is Vibrio cholerae. Sound familiar? But there's a very high rate of intestinal disease near the coastlines all over the world, even in the US, because of other species of Vibrio. You go to the doctor, they don't even do anything. They just say, go home and, drink tea or something. And it's usually a coastal Vibrio infection. So by combining the fish biomass, the benthic data on coral and coralline algae, and the microbes, we can calculate this number we call Chi. And the important thing is that even though coral reefs are different fundamentally all over the world, they share these common properties, and we can have a unitary diagnostic. Okay, so here's the Phoenix Islands. The vast area, there are 8 islands that are little atolls poking up. There are 2 mountains that almost reach the sea, but not quite, and they're coral reefs you could dive down to. It's kind of freaky because you jump off the boat and there's nothing there for thousands of miles until you get to 50 or 60 feet. All right, so the Phoenix Islands is the largest protected area in the world. It's up for World Heritage status. This is the Serengeti. This is New England. This is California. That's where I spent September. It is huge. We got really sick getting there. The seas were very, very rough. The main thing is it represents about 16%, almost a fifth of the whole global area of ocean that's been set aside as a marine protected area. It's the only protected coral archipelago in the world. And it has a lot of deep sea and blue water. It's not just coral reef. In July 2002, the New England Aquarium sent an expedition to the Phoenix Islands, and they found 100% live coral cover. In November, the Planetary Coral Reef Foundation, these are the people who had been locked up in Biosphere. Remember Biosphere? Yeah, after they were allowed out, they took the boat that had been their bonding mechanism prior to getting locked up, and they went around the world to look at coral reefs. And Lindsay Freeman, a student from Lindsay Feldman, a BUMP student, was on the boat, and I get an email from the Central Pacific, and it's Lindsay saying, the Phoenix Islands are dead. And I go, that can't be, and send me a picture. And she sends via satellite from a sailing vessel in the middle of absolutely nowhere a picture of the Phoenix Islands reef, and it's electric pink. And I write back, this is good news, not bad news. Someone had hit the reset button, and coral and algae had jacketed the reef, and it was preparing for a new regenerative cycle. But what happened in those few months was astounding. This is a sea surface temperature map, and all of this red is water, ocean water that is above the lethal limit of reef-building corals. And if it stays above that limit for 5 days running, the coral doesn't just lose its algae, it dies. This is the longest and deepest thermal anomaly in recorded history. The water was lethally warm for 7 months. And coral reefs over this whole vast area, but right in the middle of the Phoenix Islands, were absolutely devastated. So the question is, what happens under the very best conditions? Will the coral reef come back? And if it does, how? And what we can learn from that. So we set out on this expedition 5 days out of Fiji into the heart of the Phoenix Islands. Stuart Sandin from Scripps, David Abura from Kenya, me from Mars, Randy from the aquarium, Tawaki from Kiribati. We had 2 Kiribati colleagues with us, and armed with slates and all kinds of weird wiry contraptions, we covered the reef and got a lot of data. Actually, Rachel Morrison, who's in the audience now, is painstakingly going through the video that we got from the Phoenix Islands over several expeditions. So the coral we measured, we looked at the number of babies, we looked at the health of the coral, all kinds of stuff. But as we were looking at the coral, what we noticed is that even though much of the Phoenix Islands looked bare, there was a living shield of rapacious herbivores. You could hear them constantly crashing into, grazing, browsing the reef, and clearing out all the algae. And under those harsh grazing conditions, only coralline algae, only that pink stuff can survive. And that pink stuff is the foundation for a new reef. This, by the way, is the famous bumphead parrotfish, which is about the projected size. And it mows coral the way you mow your lawn. Okay, here's the sea of pink algae and these wonderful little baby corals taking root. We call them CCAs, crustose coralline algae. All right, so what's going on in the Phoenix Islands? Well, all of these things are changing in the right direction. Coral is increasing. Crustose coralline algae is increasing. Competitive fleshy algae is decreasing. Rubble has not changed, meaning no more coral has died. This is wonderful. We have our Rosetta Stone. We have a coral reef that is formerly under pristine conditions, is hit exclusively by a global impact, not by any local impacts, and now we can see what the best case scenario is for regeneration. When we looked across all the data from the Northern Line Islands, the Southern Line Islands, and the Phoenix Islands, though, a depressing signal came out. These black bars, again, are the big sharks and giant groupers and things like that. Phoenix Islands, only Enderbury Island had this anticipated level of predator biomass. What happened in the Phoenix Islands? We found out that 2 years previously, a shark finning fleet had come through. and we had exact numbers on shark densities from before and after. So they missed Enderbury Island, but unfortunately there was this one additional impact out of Korea. The sharks had been removed for shark fin soup. Okay, now with this, the benefit of these comparative data from around the world, we can find out how many fish there should be on a coral reef. So the Southern Line Islands, 450 grams per meter squared. That's almost like a pound of fish in every square meter. We're talking monsters roaming over the reef constantly. Phoenix Islands, 259. Northwest Hawaiian Islands, 243. Even the famed Great Barrier Reef is down to 90 to 240. Jamaica, my beloved Jamaica, 20 grams of fish per meter squared, less than that. So that's actually true of most of the Caribbean. So what we are used to, what we grew up with, was already compromised by 2 orders of magnitude. Now, what we learned fundamentally is that you can, if you reduce local impacts, bring things back to a reasonable and productive state that's good for people. One of the interesting things in the Phoenix Islands that we saw was places where a shipwreck or an iron chain lay along the reef. Iron, which is also often a limiting nutrient, spurred the growth of algae that killed the coral. The point is not that it's so hard to get rid of all these impacts. The point is if you get rid of the local impacts, it can make a huge difference. It's enormously hopeful. So in order to measure things like the resilience of the reef, we came up with some diagnostics, and I'll briefly mention a few, and then Professor Finnerty is going to talk about our baby, I think the best one. One test that we're using around the world is called the Coral Resilience Assay, and it's at an organismal level. And what we do is we drill a hole into the coral, just like a parrotfish, and we simply watch it recover. It's like, how many of you got scratch tests for allergies as kids? So this is a scratch test for a coral, and it's to test its regenerative capacity. Another thing we did is look for baby corals. You see that green spot? Well, if you don't put it under fluorescent light using a technique developed by Charlie Maisel, another Bump alum, you will never find that baby coral. So we can now measure and count baby corals very, very early in recruitment to give us a much earlier indicator of reef resilience. We've also done massive experiments where we clear away algae to see how quickly, if there were enough grazers, how quickly would the coral come back. So with this new suite of diagnostics, this new underwater little black bag, actually some of you don't even know what I'm referring to. In the old days, doctors came to your house and they had little black bags with things that they hit you with, and it made you better. So we now have a little black bag for tropical nearshore environments.